I was around 9 or 10 years old. We lived in a home surrounded by forest on two sides. I loved the forest. There was always something enticing about it for me, and I would often venture out there alone. One evening, a completely normal evening just before dusk, my mother asked me to go and fetch a package of ground beef from the deep freezer. Our deep freezer was located in the back of the house in a sunroom with mostly windows covering the two corner walls. These windows faced the forest. I had been back there often and was not worried at all when I entered the room. I opened the freezer and was leaning over into it, trying to find what my mom had asked for, when I heard a tapping on the window. It was a loud tapping sound. I knew both my parents were in the house, so it couldn't have been one of them, and we didn't have any close neighbors, so right away I was frightened, and I didn't want to look up. The room also seemed suddenly darker, as if the lights had been dimmed. I remember the thought flashing through my head that in the dark, whoever was out there could see me better than I would be able to see them. The tapping continued, and I finally gathered the courage to look up. That's when I saw it. A little man. There was a little man, maybe 2 or 3 feet tall, standing on the other side of the window, staring at me. He was wearing a tattered hat and raggedy clothing, and he was grinning creepily at me. He looked menacing and dirty. His fingernails, still tapping on the glass, were long and caked with dirt. Then he signaled for me to come closer. I'd had enough. I slammed the freezer down and ran back through the house to find my mom. I remember I was shaking head to toe when I told my mom what I had just experienced. She claimed to believe me, and for the rest of the time we lived there, I never went near that part of the house again. And I never went into the forest alone, or with anyone else. This experience has stayed with me ever since. To this day, I'm not comfortable in wooded areas, and sometimes, when I'm sitting by a window, I swear I can feel eyes on me, as if all these years later, it's watching me still, and waiting. For what? I don't know. It's probably just my imagination, but it's a sense that I just can't shake. All I know is that as long as I live, I will never forget that face. I just wonder what it wanted with me. It was late summer, way back in 85 or maybe 86. I'd been playing with my friends all day in the woods, playing up, in, and around the trees, and in the forest stream. After parting ways with my friends, I made my way home by myself. Soon I came to a little old medieval bridge that passes over a stream and leads to a trackway which runs across a large field towards my home. The bridge tops a little weir that roars over mossy ragstone. As I approached the bridge, which I had crossed many times before, I suddenly felt a very peculiar feeling. Not dread or fear, but certainly not a comfortable feeling. I became very aware of the sunlight, which seemed to have taken on a golden hue. It was beautiful. Sun shards were piercing plump summer boughs in a way that I had seen before in the English wood, and yet today the effect seemed somehow more defined. The insects dancing in the light seemed louder. It's really difficult to describe. Ordinarily, their gentle buzz is audible but isn't pervasive. Yet now it seemed like they were right by my ear. I thought maybe I was just hot and tired and needing a drink of water, so I sat down to rest and to cool off a little. As I began to chill out, my attention was drawn to the rocks beneath the bridge. Something was sitting there on top of the rocks. It was a wee man. He was maybe 2 foot in height, with his bare feet dangling in the water. I could see he had a long white beard, a tonsured crown that seemed burnt red by the sun. He wore an old-style frock coat, which was russet in color, and black pantaloons. Beside him was a tricorn hat and a pair of brown moleskin shoes with big buckles. I can only describe his skin color as chestnut brown. His face was wrinkled like a prune. 2 long ears, pointed at the end, drew back behind his wispy hair. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I leapt up. That was when the little man's head whipped around, and I have never forgotten the look of surprise and shock that just crashed onto his puckered little face. He whipped up his hat and shoes before he promptly vanished. I turned and ran back into the woods in a panic to get away from what I had just seen. I didn't go back across the bridge. Instead, I went to the top of the woods and along the road that circumnavigated the wood. It meant a mile or so getting added to my journey home, but rather that than getting a fairy curse placed upon me. I have been back to the little bridge many times since, and each time I approach the area near the bridge, I make sure I call out a greeting, just so the ancient wee man doesn't get such a shock. I've always known that fairies were real, never doubted it, and even into adulthood. I can feel when they are near, and always keep a respectful distance. I will never travel anywhere faintly rural at Samhain, so as not to run the risk of encountering any unseelie fae moving between their forts. But in all my life, I had never experienced such a close encounter with one of them, nor have I ever again since. And I don't think I particularly want another one either. I'm happy to just let them be. As it was summer, I have no doubt the wee man was one of the Seelie court, and therefore benevolent. But there was still something unsettling about him. This was a very brief encounter, but maybe interesting for some. I was out on a walk, making my way across a wide field in a very rural area, when I saw a very small man, less than half the size of a human. Like me, the man was also walking across the field. He crossed the path I was walking on, heading west across the field while I was heading north. He was wearing a workman's apron over his clothes, and I think he was carrying a bag or satchel, something like that. Looked like he was about some business rather than just taking in the scenery. Just before he was about to reach the edge of the field and pass into the woods, he disappeared into thin air. And it was like he was never there. Strangely, I was not at all afraid, upset, or even excited when it happened. Just matter-of-factly noted that he was there, and then disappeared, and that this was something out of the ordinary. I guess in Ireland he might have been called a leprechaun. In Sweden, where I live, we also speak of little people under various names. He was smaller than we are, but otherwise looked like us. I I feel certain he was one of the fairies because of his characteristics. I imagine ghosts would be life-size, aliens would look different, angels would make a much bigger impression, etc. And this man couldn't have been a human being. He had to have been one of the supernatural little people, as he disappeared into thin air. For context, I am a young woman. My Fae encounter happened about 3 years ago. I had just turned 21 and lived with my mother and sister in an apartment. It was a late night when I had just come home from work. My mother was still awake in the kitchen cleaning up. She had poured me a glass of red wine. I sat on the couch sipping it. Once I drank about half the glass, I got up to use the restroom. I brought my glass along with me. Once I turned on the light to my bathroom, I felt a sudden energy shift. It was as if I had entered a tunnel or vacuum. All sound had escaped me, which is crazy because there's always a loud fan that turns on with the bathroom light. I felt like I was in a between space, between the physical world and another world overlapping ours. I had focused my vision on a single spot in the bathroom where light and space started to distort. The distortion eventually turned into an apparition, and then a full-on figure. Standing in front of me, about 2.5 feet tall, was a humanoid creature. It was rather plump, with skinny arms, hands, and legs. Its clothes had earth-toned colors with a collared shirt. On its head was a small patch of blonde hair. It had a wrinkly face with abnormally big, downgraded eyes, and a long, pointy nose, and a big mouth. This creature was staring at me with a big smile on its face. I was in shock. I knew it had manifested itself from nothing, so I knew it wasn't human. I was so surprised I couldn't even scream. As I stared back at it, flabbergasted, the creature began to frown at me. It looked like it was about to cry. Instinctively, I put my arm out to see if I could console it, but before I could say anything, it faded away. I was beside myself. All the sound in the space just suddenly started to come back, similar to a spaceship filling itself with oxygen. I went back into the kitchen to tell my mother what I had just experienced. She listened intently and seemed uncomfortable, but in no way did she disregard my story, though she quickly changed the subject. I think she believed me but didn't want to dwell on what had happened out of fear. I knew deep inside myself that it was a fairy creature I had seen. Keep in mind, I hadn't even finished my wine when this happened, so I wasn't intoxicated. The next day, I broke out my Good Fairies, Bad Fairies book by Brian Froud. I looked through the book to see if I could find a fairy that resembled the little creature I had seen. Sure enough, in the Bad Fairy section, I saw a gnome that sort of looked like the thing I saw. It was described as being a type of guardian for a house. However, it would still play tricks on you if it was feeling up to it. On top of that, it was described as being fond of alcoholic beverages like beer and wine. This gnome would even steal your drinks if you weren't looking. A few years later, we moved out of that house, and I haven't seen anything like that little bathroom gnome ever since. This past summer, my dad, my brother, and I went camping. We'd reserved a spot that was fairly far from any towns or civilization in general. It was in a beautiful forest, which was really thick and green. Our site sat on the edge of the campgrounds. The back of it trailed off into a forest, and the left side had a barrier of bushes, flowers, and small plants. It wasn't until the second day that we were there that I started hearing and seeing a small creature hop about in the bushes. It was no more than 4 or 5 inches tall and quite nimble. He was definitely walking on 2 feet. It would hop about our site, and I could tell it was there every time we were. I couldn't make out many features, but I somehow knew it was watching us. However, whenever I got closer, reached out to it, or spoke to it, it would scramble away incredibly fast. On a few occasions, something tore our garbage open during the night. And oddly enough, there were never any claw marks, just some very sparkly grit surrounding the area. I never figured out if it was just a type of bird I'd never seen before, which is very unlikely. I mean, what kind of bird leaves sparkly grit behind? Or if it was a fairy that was perhaps studying me and my family. Once, when I was spending the night with a girlfriend, we got into a bad argument. She didn't kick me out. She told me I could sleep on the couch. I woke in the middle of the night and looked down at my feet and saw something peeking at me from the corner of the couch. It attempted to only partially hide itself, then it peeped around the corner again. This time I could immediately see its face, which seemed to be a face within a face, which growled and laughed at me both at the same time. This made me extremely disturbed and scared all at the same time. I balled myself into a corner as it leered and gazed at me sinisterly. I remembered a friend had told me that if anything tried to mess with me, anything supernatural, I could chant the word hue, elongated and pronounced like a hue that describes the tint of a color. I sang, hue, 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 shaking with confused fear. The nasty little thing made a pealing scream and ran down into the darkened hallway, which seemed darker than normal because of a nightlight at the end of the couch. I stood with my hand on the end of the couch, hoping to God the hue sound had worked, when my eyes had adjusted a little to the darker hallway. It was still hard to see into the dark area, but then I thought I heard something, and peeping around the corner again was this thing. I just made myself march down the hall even though I shook with fear. I took in a deep breath, let out an elongated phew, and headed right at the entity. I heard this piggish squeal, running farther and farther away. Thank God the hue sound worked. I turned out the light, looked round the corner at the basement door, and woke up my girlfriend and said, "What the hell have you been doing that would attract something like that?" And to my surprise, she laughed and told me how she'd been playing around with the Rosicrucian religion a little bit, but she said she thought she had never gotten any results. Yeah, right, was all I could say. Telling of this experience has earned me much ridicule. My parents actually had me evaluated as a child because of it. Long story short, I'm not crazy. The doctor just claimed I had a healthy imagination mixed with a bit of night terrors. I believe it was something more than that. I believe I experienced something real. I know how absurd my story will sound, but I swear on everything holy that I truly experienced what I'm about to share. When I was a little girl growing up in the 1970s, I would help my grandpa feed the fairies at his house. He would tell me how important it was to appease the fairies for any wrongs towards nature that you may have committed. It doesn't matter if you meant to hurt nature or not. Even wrongs done in innocence meant you had a debt to pay. For example, we would leave out offerings to the fairies after digging up sassafras root for brewing on top of the cast iron fire stove. Or after mushroom hunting, leaving out milk and bread was the sort of offering to the fairies we would typically make. According to my grandpa, there was no such thing as cute little fairies. They were all tricksters with evil intent. Of course, my grandma and parents would get on my grandpa for filling my mind with such stories, afraid the stories would scare the bejesus out of me. He would just respond by telling them that they better hope they never come eyeball to eyeball with a fairy. At the time, I really didn't know how to take these stories because my grandpa was typically a jokester. He seemed very serious about the fairy business, though. The things he told me sounded very logical to me at the time. For example, he told me never ever tell a fairy your name, no matter how much they beg. And remember that they are very tricky and will do anything they can to get you to tell them your name. If you tell them your name, then you become their property and they can do as they will with you. All that said, I never expected to see a real life fairy. Then one night, I did. I was awakened by a bouncing sensation at the foot of my bed. I assumed it was a cat, and I kind of pushed at her with my foot to settle her down. I was repaid with a bite to my toe. My cat didn't typically bite, especially in a mean way. I tried to sit up to put the cat on the floor, but I then realized that it wasn't my cat at my feet, because my cat was laying on my pillow, tangled up in my long hair, which was a typical spot for her to sleep. Now this terrified me. I got loose from the cat and jerked my blankets up off my feet. Enough light poured into the window from the moon that I could see what was actually at the foot of my bed. My cat started a low growling and curved her spine into a hump as she stared in that direction. Then she took off, running out of the room, leaving me to fend for myself. What I saw at the foot of my bed were 3 little people. I didn't automatically think that these were fairies because any depiction of fairies I had ever been shown were tiny creatures. But no, these were much bigger than that. I would say that the tallest was about a foot high. They wore odd little clothes made of strange material that appeared very organic in nature. From what I could see in the moonlight, their skin was a strange grayish color. Their features were human-like, yet grotesquely so. These creepy things were far from cute. They seemed to be laughing at me, and I screamed for them to go away. Their chattering, which I assumed was laughing but sounded more like weird songbird calls, got louder and then faded. I closed my eyes and screamed for my mother. When I opened my eyes, they were gone. They continued to visit me periodically until we moved out of that house. There were times that they seemed to have taken me to their world. It's as if they did some sort of magic spell on me to put me to sleep, and then I would be taken back to their realm through my mind or dreams or something like that. After a while, they would return me to my bed. They would pinch me or bite me when I refused to acknowledge them. But once I did acknowledge them, they drew me into that weird fairyland dream world, which is very difficult for me to really explain. My parents never believed me and blamed it on the stories Grandpa told. I stopped feeding the fairies at Grandpa's house because I knew they were evil now, whether you tried to appease them or not. Grandpa only ever reminded me to never tell them my name. He never laughed or said it was just my imagination. He just responded to my stories matter-of-factly. I think he kind of felt bad that I was being hounded by the fairies. Since adulthood, I have heard many stories like mine. I believe it's best never to feed the fairies to begin with. I think doing so, acknowledging them in any way, opens a door between our world and theirs. I think, based on what little I can remember of the fairy world, that door should remain closed. Thanks for watching, and thanks to everyone who submitted their stories for this one. Let me know what you thought of these stories. Have you ever encountered anything similar? Do you have any theories about the fairy world? If so, let me know down in the comments. I'll be there joining the discussion today, answering questions and reacting to comments and suggestions for future content. If you have a story to share, you can check out my website at scaryfairygodmother.com, link in the description. It has a spot where you can submit your stories, comments, questions, or suggestions. You can also sign up for my mailing list there, which will have updates about my upcoming novel. It's free to sign up. If you do submit your story or have submitted it in the past and I haven't narrated it yet, that doesn't mean I won't. It often takes me a while to get to all the stories. So if you do submit, eventually you probably will hear your story on this channel. I'm really trying to get to them all, so thank you so much for taking the time to share it with us. As always, special thanks go to my supporters on Patreon who are helping to keep this content going. Thank you so much, you guys. I really appreciate the support you are giving this work. If you like this content and would like to support it, please check out my Patreon page. The link is in the description. The stories in this video came courtesy of subscribers, so thanks to everyone who submitted. The stories were edited a little bit just for dramatic and narration reasons. But if you have a story and you'd like to share it, check out my website or email it to me. Leave a comment below, like, share, and subscribe if you're new. It really helps the channel when you do that. And hit the bell to receive notifications of new videos. And until next time, this has been a visit from your scary fairy godmother.